to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series of videos. This is day 4 of NaNoWriMo. My name is Lynn Johnston and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. So by day 4, your protagonist is probably starting to get in over their heads. And if they're not, you really want to think about how you can escalate your protagonist's conflict. We want the protagonist's conflict, the problems they're experiencing, to continue to expand. We want the efforts that they're making to solve their problems exacerbate the problems instead and make them worse. And your protagonist should be starting to feel pretty frustrated by now. They've been over the scenes that you've been writing for the last 3 days, your protagonist has been trying to get things to go back to normal and trying to close up that hole in the fabric of their space-time, and it's not working. So at this point, your protagonist is probably clinging a little bit to their everyday world and trying to cling to the familiar. They're starting to feel frustrated by their lack of success. Even if maybe they're having a little bit of success, it's not going exactly the way they want, and their problems are getting bigger. So they might want to withdraw. They might find themselves sticking their head in the sand. And this is really a great place for you to be revealing more character. We want to see what your protagonist is like, not when things are going fantastic, but when things are going in a way that just like really isn't what they want, and it feels kind of out of control, or maybe they feel like they're doing the right thing, but they're not getting the results they want. And that's kind of where you start to see what your character is made of. Like, is your protagonist someone who handles stress well? Are they someone who sticks to their guns? Or are they someone who gets kind of lost when things get difficult? Are they someone who relies on friends or family? Are they someone who basically isolates themselves and feels like, no, I must conquer this myself without anyone helping me? This day 4 area is a fantastic opportunity for you, now that your protagonist is a little bit worn down and a little bit frustrated, maybe a little raw around the edges, to show the reader what kind of character he or she really is. And also, this is a great place to think about foreshadowing your climax. You want to think about how you can plant the seeds right in this area of your story, so that when the character is facing their big choice at the climax of the story, the one that's going to determine who they are as a person and change the course of their life for the rest of their lives, your opportunity to kind of like hint at what that character is really going to be like at the climax is right now. So the way that you foreshadow that choice is somewhere here in the beginning of your story, and this is a good place for it. Think about what that big choice is going to be like, and see if you can give your protagonist a little teeny choice that kind of mirrors the big choice. If your character's loyalty is going to be tested at the climax, and they're basically going to have to choose, do I do what's good for me or do I save my friend? Here in day 4, this is a fantastic time for you to show your character, in a very small way, having to choose between what they want or what's good for them and something that a friend wants. And depending on what you're going to do with their growth arc, you could go either way. If you want to, if you need to show that your character is, for example, very selfish or self-absorbed, when you have them make the small choice, you do want them to go with the choice of doing what's good for them instead of for the friend. So that over the course of the story, as you're tearing your character down and having them realize, oh my gosh, I've been so selfish, I need to stop that. By the time you get to the climax and they have to make that big choice of loyalty between what would benefit them and what would be good for a friend, at the climax, when they make the choice that's good for their friend, that shows that your character has grown. So this is a great time when you're thinking about how you're going to reveal character to also think about your growth arc. And we're going to talk more about growth arc later, but this is just a good time to start thinking about it. Okay, so the other characters in your story, here's some brainstorming questions to kind of help you, not just with these other characters, but also help you come up with some interesting interactions between the other characters and your protagonist. You can ask yourself, who can the protagonist turn to for help? Who wants to see your protagonist fail? Whose expectations are not being met by the protagonist? Who's not meeting the protagonist's expectations? And also, who's in the protagonist's way? As the protagonist is getting deeper and deeper into the main conflict of the story and kind of getting sucked into that situation, which we're going to hit like around day 7, where it's like, oh, they really just have to make a decision and they're going to have to take up whatever goal it is they're going to be pursuing for the rest of the story. Thinking about now how you can set that up through conflict with the other characters, that's going to help you over the next couple of days, not have your story kind of stall out. It's really common when you're writing a story, especially if you don't have strong conflicts in mind already, to like come out with an initial burst on day 1 and day 2. You're like, oh, I got this great problem for the character to solve. And then, of course, you can't have your character just sitting there and not solving any problems, so they start trying to solve the problems. And it's real easy around day 3 and day 4 to have them partially solve their problems, and then the story kind of goes flat. There's no conflict there. So you always want to be thinking, how am I going to escalate the conflict? And interpersonal conflict is a fantastic way to do that. So again, looking at the conflict of your story, you can ask yourself, what's happening around the protagonist that makes it harder for the protagonist to see the solution to their problems? And some of this can be internal, some of it can be their flaw or their mistaken belief or whatever it is that they're going to be overcoming or letting go of during the story. But some of it can be what's happening around them. If your protagonist is a teenager, they probably don't have a perfect relationship with their parents. And even if their parents are well-meaning and trying to help them out, that age gap there, as anybody who's been a teenager or had a teenager knows, it's like you can both be trying to communicate with each other and reaching out for help or trying to offer advice, and it can still come off as feeling like interference or being told what to do. And that's going to trigger stuff for a teenage protagonist. And of course, adults are the same way. A crappy work situation or somebody in your protagonist's environment that just rubs them the wrong way. Look and see if you can find a way to introduce some additional conflict just to make it harder for the protagonist to focus on the real problem and solve it. Also ask yourself, what's happening around the protagonist that makes it harder for him or her to commit to the journey? And that moment of commitment that we're going to hit in a few days is really important. James Scott Bell, I believe, is the author. He's written a book on plot, and he talks about there being 2 doors in your story. The first one is the point where your protagonist commits to the journey that they're going to take. It's like they're stepping through a doorway. That's when they step into the extraordinary world and really go for whatever it is that you want them to do in the story. And then the second doorway is right before the climax, when they recommit after the dark moment, and head on into the climax, and they're like, I'm going to do this or I'm going to die. But we're not there yet. So again, you want to think about just for this doorway that's coming up, how can you set your protagonist up so that when they get to the point of having to decide that they're going to take down the evil empire or get the girl of their dreams to go to homecoming, whatever their goal is that they're going to have to decide to pursue, you don't want that to be an easy decision. You want that to be tough. You want them to look at it and say, oh my God, I'm going to have to sacrifice to get that. It's going to be hard work, so that it means something when they actually are willing to commit to it. Setting. What new resources exist in your setting that the protagonist might discover? By day 4, your protagonist has probably changed locations or moved between locations at least once, unless you're writing something where all the characters are locked in an elevator or in a dome on the moon. But chances are you're going to have multiple locations at this point. And there might be things in the setting that either have been introduced that the protagonist hasn't used yet, or that maybe you could introduce here in day 4, or maybe in the next day in day 5, that would give the protagonist an opportunity to stop banging their head against the wall and try something new. You also could ask yourself, how are things changing as the protagonist continues to wrestle with their problems? If your protagonist is trying to do something, their efforts are going to impact the people around them and their environment and them. It's like their frustration levels are changed. They've tried something and doesn't work, so they're going to probably change their approach. The people around them may or may not notice what they're doing, but if the characters around them do notice, some of them probably object. Maybe some of them are just like dangerous because they might draw attention to it by commenting on it. But whatever your setting is right now, and whatever secondary characters you have in that setting, think about how they're being impacted by the protagonist's efforts to solve his or her problems, and then how they're going to respond as they see the protagonist affecting their lives. Story promise. Over the past 3 days, you've probably made several promises to the readers, some of which you may be conscious of and some of which you may not. So I would encourage you to think about it. What have you promised the readers in the first few scenes that you've written? Have you promised them that you're going to write something that's going to make them laugh or cry? Have you promised them a love story? Have you promised them that your protagonist is broken but he's going to heal? Have you promised them that they're going to see a lot of skullduggery and intrigue? Basically, whatever the tone is for those scenes, whatever the kind of scenes you showed the reader, and whatever kinds of characters you've shown the reader, those are all essentially promises you've made, that the rest of the story is going to be fairly consistent with what they've already seen. And of course, you're going to give them surprises, but it's really hard to get the reader to accept a big change from what they got in the first couple chapters. If you suddenly take the tone from comic to dark, or you suddenly stick a romance in halfway through where the characters were just like totally bitter and isolated before that, your reader's going to be disappointed. And I know I've talked about this before, and I'm going to keep talking about it because broken promises are one of the biggest reasons that readers are disappointed in the books they read. So it's super important to understand what you're promising the reader by what you include at the beginning of the story. Getting started. Once again, don't forget your pre-writing ritual. Don't forget to do your warm-up exercises. If it helps you, reread what you wrote yesterday. If rereading what you wrote yesterday just makes you crazy because it makes you want to edit, or it just makes you want to write something else, then don't read what you wrote yesterday. Different things work for different people. If you are one of those people who can't reread yesterday's work without wanting to edit, another thing you could do is you could either start by looking at your outline or whatever character notes you have and just rereading them just to get yourself in touch with your story again so that it's easier to write. And don't worry if you're not sure how good your opening is. Right now, at least in my experience, like when I'm writing the first quarter of a novel, I almost always think it's crap. And it's not because it's crap, it's because it's unfinished. And the way that we tend as writers to evaluate our work is we will take our first draft, which we haven't edited, and which we're going to have to rewrite a couple of times before it's going to be good enough to send anywhere, and we compare it to these finished novels that we've read. And that's a really dangerous comparison, because the novel that you read by your favorite author wasn't just rewritten a couple of times by the author. It was critiqued by their critique partners. It was they got feedback from their beta readers, and then they had at least 3 people at their publisher edit it for them too, because their editor will send them edits. A copy editor will look at it, and of course the edits from the the edits from their the person who's actually editing for content can happen a couple of times. They'll go back and forth, and then there'll be copy edits, and then there'll be proofing, and sometimes the copy editor and the proofer will catch things too. So when you look at the thing that you just wrote yesterday, trying to get the bare bones of the story out, and you say, oh my gosh, it's not as good as what my favorite author just published, I'm never going to make it, you're basically setting yourself up for failure there. It's like, in order to have a really good evaluation of your own writing at the rough draft stage, you have to be comparing it to your favorite author's rough draft, which of course we don't have access to. So whatever you feel about your opening, I'm just going to recommend that you set it aside and say, it's good enough for now. I can edit it later. Nora Roberts is famous for saying, I can edit anything but a blank page. And that's basically what you're trying to do, is fill up those blank pages so you can start editing them and making them good. After you write, I strongly encourage you to always celebrate your progress and prepare for tomorrow. Do whatever it takes to get yourself set up so that tomorrow you don't have to do any work before you start writing. You can just sit down and write. Thanks for hanging out with me on day 4. I hope you'll come back for more tomorrow. I'll be posting these videos, as always, at writesmarternotharder.com. I hope to see you again, and happy writing.